Hariske Irini, and welcome back to Paul's letter to the Romans. In the previous episode, we talked about Paul's ministry leading up to this letter, his early life, his conversion, and his ministry. In this episode, we'll be talking about his purpose for this letter to the Romans. We are also going to outline Romans, at least give a brief overview of it, as well as take a brief look at what Grecco-Roman letters of this time look like, and we're going to compare them to the New Testament letters. There's a lot in this single episode, so let's go ahead and dive in. Defining terms. Let's start with the basics. In this podcast, I'm going to use the word content to refer to what is actually said. And I'm going to use the word meaning to refer to what the author was trying to communicate. Yes, those are two different things. Now, sometimes what someone says and what they mean, they actually have nothing to do with each other. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but if you think about it, let's pretend, for example, you're being sarcastic. What you mean and what you say are the exact opposite in that case. Maybe there's some kind of an inside joke. In that situation, what it means can only be determined by a specific person who has the context, right? In an inside joke, the context of what you're saying or truly meaning is only known by a few people who are on the inside, and everybody else who isn't in on the joke will only have the standard context of what they can see. They don't have that insight. And so they're interpreting your words trying to interpret your words without having that inside context. And so that's where we kind of see the distinction between what someone says and what they mean. So content and meaning are actually two different things. And boy, I would really love to get in deep on these topics. But for our little podcast, I'm going to have to leave it at that. There is what someone says, that's content, and what someone means, and that is what they intend to communicate. Now, today, we're going to focus on what we mean by the word purpose and its related concept, occasion. When we ask a question like, hey, why did Paul write Romans? We're actually asking two different questions. One is, what caused Paul to write Romans? And by that, we mean, what was the trigger? What was the catalyst? What caused him to sit down to write that letter? This is occasion. Now, there's a second thing that we're asking when we ask, why did Paul write Romans? And it is, what was he trying to accomplish by writing the letter? So the first one is, what caused him to write the letter? And now it's, what was he trying to accomplish? That is, what did Paul want his audience to do? How did he want them to respond after they read the letter? Now, this is purpose. Occasion and purpose are two different things. Occasion asks, what triggered the letter? And purpose asks, what is the intended outcome of the letter? Now, sometimes occasion and purpose can seem similar, but they're actually two very different things. And they both have a very big impact on how we understand the meaning of a text. Suppose that someone gets on social media and they write this really long paragraph about how this new generation of men and women are so terrible with relationships. That post, that would be the content. That's what they said, what they wrote. But you cannot know what they meant by it unless you understand what caused them to say it and what they intended to communicate. That's actually the meaning. Let me give you, let's see our example through. In this hypothetical example, let's just say the person posting is, you happen to find out, a cultural anthropologist, and they just wrote a book. And the book is about the dangers of a new trend on dating, and maybe assume that they're trying to promote their book. If you know all this background information, you will probably interpret their little rant on social media as a promotion, right? They're trying to get you interested so that you'll buy that book. Now, what if instead of being a cultural anthropologist. Let's switch it up. There's just some random boy or girl who got dumped because they're clearly narcissistic. It's the exact same post, but depending on what you know about what caused the post to be written and what their purpose is, even if it's the exact same thing, you'd realize, oh, they're just venting their frustration over some failed relationship. The same words would clearly mean something completely different if the reason they wrote it is different. What causes someone to say what they are saying has a huge impact on how we can understand it. That's the power of understanding occasion. Now, purpose, on the other hand, is what a person is trying to accomplish with their communication. It's not what triggered the communication, it's the end goal, the desired goal. So back to that scenario, if someone was ranting about a breakup, if you knew they're actually trying to manipulate the person to get back together with them, then you would understand that social media post very different than if you knew maybe they're just trying to get new followers with some dramatic sob story about a relationship that they actually didn't really care about. When you really understand what caused somebody to write something and what their real goal is, it allows you to look at that text and understand that writing much, much better. When you understand what caused someone to write as well as what they were hoping to accomplish with that communication, you can interpret their actual words much more accurately and avoid massive errors. Understanding occasion and purpose is critical in understanding any form of communication, especially when you're trying to understand something that's as old as Paul's letter to the Romans. Occasion. Okay, so let's talk about the occasion for Romans. We've already spent 2 episodes talking about Paul's background, his early life, conversion, and Christian ministry. We went over a lot of background info, but we didn't really get into the specific event or the trigger or catalyst that led Paul to even write the letter to the Romans. So what actually happened that made Paul decide to write Romans? Well, the good news is that Paul did give us a lot of clues. He tells us in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 13, that he has desired to see the Romans for quite some time, but despite his efforts, his plans have not come to fruition. He doesn't say much more about that here because at this point, he's just trying to transition into the content of the actual letter. But once we get to the end of the letter, Paul actually tells us a little bit more about the occasion. In Romans chapter 15, verses 22 to 29, Paul again goes into why he wrote the letter. He says that now having no more room to share the gospel in the areas he's evangelized, he wants to go to Spain. And it is in this little unassuming detail that for most of us, right, casual readers, it's nothing more than a bit of Bible trivia that we actually have a cornerstone to understanding the occasion behind Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, to put this all together, we have to understand a little bit about geography. So if you Google a map of Paul's missionary journeys while you listen to this, that might be kind of helpful. Paul's home church is in Antioch in Syria. And yes, there's more than one Antioch, by the way. You're looking for the one all the way to the right on the map. That means the church that is providing the bulk of his logistical support is on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea, which happens to be on the eastern border of the entire Roman Empire. Naturally, Paul's 3 missionary journeys have been working his way west from Syria, right? From his home church, he's working his way west towards Turkey, then Greece. Paul, though, has explicitly said that he feels there's no more room for him to evangelize in Turkey or Greece. By his standards, all of Turkey and Greece have been evangelized. So if Paul was continually moving west, from Turkey, it would have been Greece, and then it would be Rome. So he could make his next mission trip to Rome. But because of Rome's status as the heart of the Roman Empire, Rome was actually probably one of the first places to hear the gospel and already had a very established church. The only place west of Rome then, as he continues looking for another place to share the gospel, is Spain. So if you look at a map and you're kind of measuring distance, Spain is pretty far from his sending church back in Syria. Actually, it's roughly about 2,000 miles, which is more than twice the distance that Paul had already traveled from his home church during his last 3 missionary journeys. Paul was not one to expect to travel luxuriously. That's pretty evident from his writings in the book of Acts. But he was going to need some support to make this thing happen. On the map, Rome makes a whole lot of sense. It's less than 700 miles from Spain. There's also a very well-established Christian church there, and as the center of travel for the empire, logistical support would be much more feasible for the Romans than from the church back in Antioch, which is almost 3 times the distance away. So, help from Rome was logically the best option, but there are some issues that had to be dealt with in order to make that happen. For one, Paul had never been to Rome. He didn't have any personally established relationships with them. Second, Paul had a lot of controversy surrounding him. His message, his mission, all of that was very controversial, even amongst Christians. In addition to that, Paul's ministry to the Gentiles had greatly affected the church and raised some really difficult questions. If Paul really hoped to have the Roman Christians show up to help him logistically with the mission to Spain, he had to address a lot of different things. Purpose. With all of this in mind, Paul's purpose in writing to the Romans starts to become very clear. His goal is to gain from the church in Rome logistical and spiritual support for his mission to Spain. As Paul puts it in Romans chapter 15, verse 24, "When I go to Spain, I hope to see you in passing and to have you help me on the way there." That's my translation again. So Paul wanted to get help to go to Spain. Now, while that actually is Paul's ultimate goal, it's not super enlightening in helping us understand his letter to the Romans. Because in order to accomplish that bigger goal, right, of getting to Spain, he actually has a lot more immediate goals that directly and more directly impact what he actually wrote about to the Romans. What I mean is this: even though he's ultimately trying to get the Romans to support him, it's the obstacles, the things he has to overcome that actually make up the bulk of the letter. He doesn't actually spend a lot of time talking about Spain itself. So knowing that he's trying to get to Spain doesn't really give us a lot of insight, because the letter to the Romans has more to do with those immediate obstacles that he's dealing with. What I mean by this is that, yes, Spain, of course, is his main ultimate goal. But in writing to the Romans, he has to tackle other smaller goals, which have a whole lot more to do with what he actually writes about in the letter. So what are those smaller goals? Well, for one, in order to get the Roman church to help him, Paul knows he has to address the controversies that surround him. Many of those controversies have to do with his message. Controversies about the relationship between legalism and faith, Gentiles and circumcision, Judaism and the gospel, salvation and sin. Those controversies, those questions were raging strong during Paul's day. By clearing up what Paul's teaching was about these topics, he could show the Roman church that they were on the same page, and maybe, just maybe, they'll buy into supporting his trip to Spain. It's this purpose which really helps us understand Paul's letter to the Romans, because these are the things that actually make up the content of the letter. What was the occasion that led Paul to write Romans? Well, it's that he's evangelized all of Turkey, Macedonia, and Greece, and by Paul's standards, he's done everything he can do there. So as he looks west, he sees Italy, but that's already well evangelized. And the next step west from there is Spain, the wild frontier of the Roman Empire. He wants to go out there, but he knows that his church in Antioch probably isn't going to be able to help him. It'd be really helpful if the Romans could help him. But again, Paul knows he's been a very controversial figure, and he doesn't have a lot of personal connections to back him up in Rome. So he needs to write this letter to clear the air about what he believes to accomplish his purpose, which is to get help from the Romans to go to Spain. Okay, now we can move on. This brings us to the question about how Paul organized his letter to the Romans. The structure of Romans. An outline is a step-by-step summary of how the author constructs his argument to make a point. Most outlines of the New Testament letters that you see in popular non-academic books tend to just throw in thematic titles to sections, which can unfortunately be very misleading. Now, the reason they do this is because they're helpful in that they'll sort of pick out memorable concepts or phrases that are really popular, and so they'll use those as the heading to a certain chapter or section. The problem with that is that they're not necessarily outlining or really identifying the key piece of information that the author intended to communicate there. They're more just trying to help you find the passage that you're looking for. So, in fact, a lot of times these headings that you might have in these study Bibles, they'll actually cause you to overlook the actual reason the author is saying what he's saying in that passage. My goal with this study is that by the end, you'll be able to pick out individual sections of Paul's letter to the Romans, and you'll know exactly why, and you'll be able to explain why he's saying what he's saying, where he's saying it. And you'll be able to connect that to his overall goal of getting to Spain. With that, we can now get into the outline of Paul's letter to the Romans. While a close, detailed study of the structure of Romans reveals a complicated set of interwoven arguments, the big picture, the bird's eye view, is actually fairly simple. There's an introduction in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 15, and that follows the standard format of all Grecco-Roman letters of that time. We'll talk about this in a little bit. After that introduction, you'll have the bulk of the letter, which makes up the main body from Romans chapter 1, verses 16, all the way to Romans chapter 15, verse 12. And that bulk of the letter is broken up into three main topics. Romans chapters 1 through 8 describe in detail what Paul's gospel is, and it focuses his definition of the gospel to clarify the controversial points. Then, in Romans chapters 9 through 11, Paul will address a major theological question occurring during his day, and that is, has God decided to give up on the Jewish people? Because as the gospel had reached across the Roman Empire, the Jews were becoming more and more resistant to the gospel as more and more Gentiles were coming to faith. As Christianity became predominantly Gentile, it led believers to wonder if God has changed his mind about his chosen people. The third and last main section of this main part of the letter is Romans 12 through 15. In here, Paul writes about practical spirituality. He covers topics such as serving the body, obedience to rulers, and he discusses how to resolve differences in opinions about things like dietary restrictions. These three sections, the Gospel of Romans, the Gospel, Romans 1 through 8, God and the Jewish people, Romans 9 through 11, and practical advice, Romans 12 through 15, make up the main content of the letter. And if you can actually remember those three main topics, those three main sections, it'll come very handy for you to find your way around Romans. Finally, the letter concludes in the last chapter and a half. Here he finally brings up his plans to go to Spain and wanting help from the Roman Church. This last bit also includes Paul's letter of recommendation for a woman named Phoebe. Now, it's actually possible that chapter 16 was not a part of Romans, but was a separate work that was eventually combined with Romans, but we have a long ways to tackle that problem. For now, I just want to give you the big picture outline of Romans. If you can remember that threefold division, we're going to be off to a good start. Grecco-Roman letters. As part of this episode, I want to also introduce you to the standard Grecco-Roman letter style. Historians actually have letters from this time period, and it's really helpful to be familiar with the letter writing style because it helps us understand the New Testament letters. One of my favorite letters from the Greco-Roman time period is called Appian to Epimachus. Now, if you're a history buff, you might know about Josephus' work called Against Appia. This is a very important classical work, but that's not the same Appian that I'm talking about. In Fayum, Egypt, 2 letters were discovered written by a young Egyptian to his father Epimachus, while the young man was away after joining the Roman military. The letters are short, they're intimate, and they're written in the standard Greco-Roman style. The author is not a Christian. He is a pagan, but his letters are very helpful in noticing the elements of letter writing that transcend religion. In other words, it allows us to see what parts of the New Testament letters aren't just a Christian thing, and instead it helps us see what is part of the normal writing style of that time. I want to take time to look at this short letter with you. It's just a few lines, but it's going to be helpful. By the way, you can actually Google Appian to Epimachus to find very clear, high-resolution images of this letter. It's a simple letter, but it's very beautiful to look at least if you're a nerd. As I read it, remember, these guys did not know Jesus or our one true God. They are pagan. We're learning about the style of writing. You're definitely not going to learn anything about theology here. Okay, let's get into the letter. Appian to Epimachus, his father and Lord, very many greetings. Before all else, I pray that you are well and that you may prosper in continual health, together with my sister and her daughter and my brother. I give thanks to the Lord Serapis because when I was endangered at sea, he rescued me immediately. When I arrived at Mysium, I received as traveling money from Caesar 3 gold pieces, and I am well. Therefore, I request you, my Lord Father, write me a letter, first about your welfare, secondly, about the welfare of my siblings, thirdly, in order that I make obeisance before your handwriting, because you trained me well, and I hope by this means quickly to advance, the gods willing. Salute Capitan very much, and my siblings, and Serenelia, and my friends. I've sent my portrait to you through Evtemenos. My name is Antonius Maximus. I pray you are well. Company, Athenonike. Okay, let's look at the letter line by line. I'm going to identify the standard features of a Greco-Roman letter. By that I mean, these are the things that are common to all letter writing in Greek during the Roman era. In the same way that in English we have a very standard format for writing emails, right? You start, Dear so-and-so, and you conclude with, Sincerely so-and-so. These are standard things that everyone does in our world. In the world of the Romans, they also had a very standard format that they followed. So let's look at these features. The first line reads, Appian to Epimachus, his father and Lord, very many greetings. The first thing you see is that, just like in the New Testament, the very first word is the name of the author. Just like Paul, or Paulos, introduced himself in every one of his letters, Appian writes his name first to identify himself. Not everyone knew how to write, and for other reasons, the author of a letter didn't always write the letter himself. Paul, for example, is the author of Romans, but if you go to the end in Romans chapter 16, verse 22, you find out that it was Tertius who was doing the actual writing. Even though it was Paul who decided what was written, he's not the one who did the writing. So it's the author, the one who's coming up with the ideas, who's dictating the letter, who is the author identified. Now, in some cases, the author doesn't just identify himself. Sometimes the author describes himself as Paul does in Romans, but we'll get into that in the next episode. The next typical feature of a Greco-Roman letter that you'll see is the identification of the recipients. And in some cases, they're also described. In this letter, the recipient is Epimachus, the author's father. Notice there's also a brief description where the son calls his father, Father and Lord, lowercase l, by the way. That's a very respectful greeting. Again, identifying the recipients is very standard, and you see the same thing in the New Testament. Paul to the Romans, Paul to the Corinthians, and so and so. The third standard element of a Greco-Roman letter is the greeting. In Greek, the standard greeting was simply to use the Greek word for greeting, which was herin. It's been noted by many people that Paul intentionally did not use that common Greek greeting, but instead he used a different Greek phrase which meant grace and peace. And in Greek that would be charis ke irini. By the way, that happens to be how I introduce every single one of my episodes. Grace and peace, charis ke irini, kind of sounds like herin. And I think that's why he liked doing that. We're going to get into more on that in the next episode. The next few lines contain the all-important prayer and thanksgiving. Before all else, I pray that you are well, and that you may prosper in continual health, together with my sister and her daughter and my brother. I give thanks to the Lord Serapis, because when I was endangered at sea, he rescued me immediately. End quote. In Greco-Roman letters, before you got into the main content of your letter, it was customary to include a prayer and a thanksgiving. You can compare this prayer and thanksgiving to Paul's in the New Testament. Sometimes Paul's prayers and thanksgivings are really short, and sometimes they expand almost half the length of that letter. But they are very important expectations in letters. When they're missing, for example, in Galatians, it would definitely have a sharp reaction. It's like not saying hi to someone who said hi to you. And in that case, he did it for a very specific purpose. He's really frustrated with the Galatians. Now, notice in this letter that Appian thanks his Egyptian god Serapis from saving him from danger at sea. To me, at least when I read it, I think the tone is so similar to the New Testament when the apostles thanked the Father and Jesus for saving them from their sins. These are the four elements that make up the introductory material of any Greco-Roman letter. The self-identification of the author, sometimes including a self-description, the identification and self-description of the recipient, the greetings, and I'm going to combine the prayer and thanksgiving. You'll see these in the New Testament as well as in secular letters of the Greco-Roman time period, of course. After these four elements, then you get into the main body of the letter. That is what the author actually is setting to write out in the letter. And I quote, "When I arrived at Mysium, I received as traveling money from Caesar 3 gold pieces, and I am well. Therefore, I request you, my Lord Father, write me a letter, first about your welfare, secondly about the welfare of my siblings, thirdly, in order that I may make obeisance before your handwriting, because you have trained me well, and I hope by this means quickly to advance, the gods willing." I'm not going to get into, trying to parse this all out. It seems pretty straightforward, and since our study's not really on Epimachus, I think it's safe to move on. But that would have been the main body of the letter. After the main body of the letter, a letter concludes with a set of salutations. Again, very common in the New Testament as well, especially in Romans, which has a really long list of salutations. After that conclusion, you have a farewell. Let's read the one Appian wrote to his father. "Salute Capitan very much, and my siblings, and Serenalia, and my friends. I've sent my portrait to you through Efthymenos. My name is Antonius Maximus. I pray you are well. Company Athenike." All right, let's review. A Greco-Roman letter has the following features: the identification and self-description of the author, identification and self-description of the recipient, and remember, self-descriptions aren't always there, the greeting, the prayer and thanksgiving, then you get to the main body of the letter, and then you have your salutations and your farewell. Paul's letter will have all of these 7 elements, and we're going to point them out as we go along in our study of Romans. Conclusion. Okay, I hope today was helpful, and I know it's a little technical, and we're finally going to get into Paul's letter to the Romans. But we did need to have that discussion about purpose. Remember, purpose is what the author is trying to accomplish. In the letter to the Romans, what Paul is ultimately trying to accomplish is get to Spain. But more immediately, he's trying to tackle these controversial issues that he's got to explain to the Romans in order to get them to understand where exactly he's coming from. And that's an important aspect to purpose because it helps us understand what Paul's goals are. Immediately, as he writes Romans, he wants the Romans to know what he actually believes and teaches in light of all the controversies that they may have heard about him. Second, we got into occasion. Occasion is what triggered the letter in the first place. And we said that for Paul, what triggered the letter to the Romans is that he feels like he's evangelized everywhere he's been. Turkey, Greece, Macedonia. If he's going to keep moving west, Italy's already established. And so the only place left is Spain. And because of that, he's going to need a church like Rome that's a lot closer to help him get there. We also talked about the outline and structure of Romans. And I give you this really big bird's eye view of Romans. And if you could just remember that threefold division, we're going to be off to a really good start. Remember, the gospel occupies chapters 1 through 8. Then we get into the question of, has God forsaken the Jews in chapters 9 through 11? And then finally, the third major section is the practical spiritual advice, chapters 10 through 15. If you can remember that threefold division, we're going to be off to a great start understanding the broad outline of Romans. We'll get obviously into a more detailed outline as we go into it. Finally, we got into the typical Greco-Roman letter features of this time period. We identified the 7, right? The author identifies himself, he identifies his audience, he gives a greeting, there's a prayer and thanksgiving. Then he gets into the main content of the letter. Finally, at the end, he concludes with a salutation and then a farewell. These are the 7 standard features which you should expect in any Greco-Roman letter, and we're going to see that Paul's letter to the Romans has all these 7. In the next episode, we're actually going to jump into Paul's letter to the Romans finally. I'm very excited about that. We'll start considering these introductory elements, that is, the identification of the author, the audience, the greeting, and the prayer and thanksgiving. I'm really stoked to do that with you. Well, until then, Godspeed.